Welcome back to the channel where today we're going to be doing another reaction video, and today we're actually going to be looking at a debate that John Lennox and Richard Dawkins had some time ago, and they'll both be making some very interesting points. We'll first start with John Lennox and let him go for just a couple minutes. We'll hear Richard Dawkins and his rebuttal. This is actually a debate about the God Delusion, the book of Richard Dawkins that he wrote, and they're debating the existence essentially of God. We're actually going to look at the period of this debate where they both had their closing argument. So pretty much right at the end where they try and sum up a little bit of what they were trying to get at in a very brief few minutes. So we're going to look at that. John Lennox is going to go first, and then we're going to hear Richard Dawkins, and then we'll make some comments.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an interesting discussion. I'll have to make my remarks very briefly. I do not think the answer is atheism, though I agree with much of the criticism that Richard makes of religion. I think the book, The God Delusion, gives the game away in the dedication at the front of the book to Douglas Adams, where he says, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" Now, you do a brilliant job at getting rid of the fairies, though it must be said that most of them didn't believe in them anyway. But when you see the beauty of a garden, say in New College in Oxford, do you believe there's no gardener or no owner? That its sublime beauty has come about from raw nature by pure chance? Of course not. For gardens are to be distinguished from raw nature by the operation of intelligence. And what you're doing in your book, I think, is presenting us with an obviously false set of alternatives. Either we take gardens on their own or the garden plus fairies. But they don't appear on their own. They have gardeners and owners. So does the universe. You say there's no evidence of God, and yet your very description of the universe as a garden bears witness that the evidence is all around you. Atheism, ladies and gentlemen, is not only false, it contains no message that deals with the central problem of human rebellion against God. History is littered with attempts to build a godless utopia, each one of them based, as the book of Genesis suggests that they would be, on a denial that God has ever spoken or even that he exists. And I would remind you that the world that Richard Dawkins wishes to bring us to is no paradise except for the few. It denies the existence of good and evil. It even denies justice. But ladies and gentlemen, our hearts cry out for justice. And centuries ago, the Apostle Paul spoke to the philosophers of Athens and pointed out that there would be a day in which God would judge the world by the man that he had appointed, Jesus Christ, and that he'd given assurance to all people by raising him from the dead. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a miracle, something supernatural, for me constitutes the central evidence upon which I base my faith, not only that atheism is a delusion, but that justice is real and our sense of morality does not mock us. Because if there is no resurrection, if there is nothing after death, in the end, the terrorists and the fanatics have got away with it.
Okay. Thank you. Please. Professor Dawkins.
Yes, well, that concluding bit rather gives the game away, doesn't it? All that stuff about science and physics and the complications of physics and things, what it really comes down to is the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's a fundamental incompatibility between the sort of sophisticated scientist, which we hear part of the time from John Lennox, and it's impressive, and we are interested in the argument about multiverses and things, and then having produced some sort of a case for a kind of deistic God, perhaps, some God, the great physicist who adjusted the laws and constants of the universe. And that's all very grand and wonderful. And then suddenly we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. It's so petty, it's so trivial, it's so local, it's so earthbound, it's so unworthy of the universe. When we go into a garden, and we see how beautiful it is, and we see colored flowers, and we see the butterflies and the bees. Of course, it's natural to think there must be a gardener. Any fool is likely to think there must be a gardener. The huge achievement of Darwin was to show that that didn't have to be true. Of course it's difficult. Of course it had to wait until the mid-19th century before anybody thought of it. It seems so obvious that if you've got a garden, there must be a gardener who created it and all that goes with that. What Darwin did was to show the staggeringly counterintuitive fact that this not only can be explained by an undirected process. It's not chance, by the way. Entirely wrong to say it's chance. It's not chance. Natural selection is the very opposite of chance, and that's the essence of it. That was what Darwin discovered. He showed not only a garden, but everything in the living world, and in principle, not just on this earth, but on any other planet, wherever you see the organized complexity that we understand, that we call life, that it has an explanation which can derive it from simple beginnings by comprehensible, rational means. That is possibly the greatest achievement that any human mind has ever accomplished. Not only did he show that it could be done, I believe that we can argue that that the alternative is so unparsimonious and so counter to the laws of common sense that, reluctant as we might be, because it might be unpleasant for us to admit it, although we can't disprove that there's a God, it is very, very unlikely indeed.
Okay, so let's stop it there, and let's make a couple comments about John Lennox's comments and Richard Dawkins' comments and their closing arguments. So both of these men are brilliant in their own way. Although Richard Dawkins does not believe that there is a God, and indeed believes that's actually a delusion, he is a very intelligent man and has done a lot of very interesting and intriguing work that you can read about that really does spark your thinking, and it's thought-provoking, and it's interesting to listen to his perspective. And of course, on the other hand, Professor John Lennox is a brilliant mind, a brilliant man who believes that there is a God, not just based on his whimsical experiences or anything like this, but this man believes from his experience and the evidence that there is a God, and he's very articulate in his understanding or in his expression of his arguments, and obviously in his understanding of those very arguments that he makes to the core. So there are two things that we'll say about John Lennox's closing arguments here, and the first one is that he goes right after the fact that atheism is empty. One of the, I think, weakest points, one of the most difficult things in my mind to hear from an atheist defend is just what their worldview is exactly. And I know that there's many terms and there's a lot of semantics when it comes to atheism and maybe some different types of atheism and what a worldview is, and they don't have a worldview but they do have a worldview, et cetera, and I understand all this, but essentially what John Lennox is trying to point out is that atheism is indeed a dead-end road, and not just for the sense of some, again, whimsical feeling of wanting to be, is there more, and can we get more, and we'd like for there to be something after this life. It's a simple matter of atheism doesn't provide evidence for the things that we are left to explain. We have all of these questions, and if someone is going to step up and say that one potential solution is indeed invalid, or in other words, an atheist come and say, like Richard Dawkins, that John Lennox's delusion is indeed that he believes in a God, well, then he should be proposing some other type of worldview, and proposing that Darwinism is the explanation of having a worldview falls utterly short and is the reason why atheism is indeed empty. The other thing that's being pointed out here is that atheism just lacks a moral code, and that's not exactly something that John Lennox brought out in his closing arguments per se, but this is just one example of how atheism just doesn't measure up. John Lennox brings out the idea that the garden, we look at a garden and we assume that there is a gardener. Well, this would be indeed a natural assumption, and some might say, well, you have to prove that. You can't just assert that and assume that. But again, consider, even Richard Dawkins admits in his opening line that if you come upon a garden, of course it's natural to assume that there is a gardener. So then, either your rational faculties that you're using to assume that there is a gardener are either faulty, and then you can't trust anything that you think if that's the case, or there is indeed a gardener. So let's move to Richard Dawkins and let's consider a couple of his points and his closing arguments. As much as I might take issue with what Richard Dawkins has said, because I believe, of course, that there is a God, I just find his closing comments nonsensical to the actual understanding of what the proposed events are in Christianity. I'll give you an example. The first thing that I'll bring up is the resurrection of Jesus. Richard Dawkins mentioned that with all of the science that we have, with all of the discoveries that we've made, with all of these brilliant, intelligent things that we have discovered, the amount of brain work that has been put into all of these discoveries, to chalk it all up basically against the resurrection of Jesus, he called it a few things. He first called it petty, then he called it trivial, then he called the resurrection earthbound, and then he called the resurrection and Jesus essentially unworthy. So the reason why I find it's some statement to say that what he has said is nonsensical, right? The reason why I find that really nonsensical is because just assume the Christian argument for a moment. The Christian argument and the biblical argument is indeed that Jesus has come down from heaven to take the form of a man, and not just any man, not just a man who would rule over the world with his mighty fists and command tens and of thousands of soldiers and have whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. This man would come down from heaven in the form of a servant. He would come down to help the poor, to help the weak. The idea that not only Jesus would come down from heaven down to this earth, not only is that not a petty thing, the fact that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, is completely antithetical to anything that is petty. Let's take Richard Dawkins' next point about it being trivial, the resurrection of Jesus being trivial. This is why it's certainly not trivial. The one thing that we all face, the one thing that irregardless of what your worldview is, irregardless of what you believe, how strong you believe it, you believe that there is a God, you don't believe that there is a God, you believe this, you believe that, irregardless of any of those things, irrespective of any of those things, the one thing that binds us all in one sense is that we will die. So the reason why this isn't trivial, the fact that we all have to face death ourselves and we have to watch the people that we love around us die, and even just people that we don't really even know, we have to watch people die in this world. That is not a trivial thing, and we link this to the resurrection in this way. If you take that biblical worldview, then the belief is that Jesus not only died on the cross, but indeed that he was resurrected. So then, if Jesus is resurrected, we too can share in that resurrection, ultimately defeating death, the one thing that is held over us, the one thing that none of us can do anything about, the one thing that is unbelievably tragic and sad, not just for us, but to watch others around us die that we love. This is defeated by the resurrection of Jesus. The idea of the resurrection being earthbound is the third argument, basically, the third statement that Richard Dawkins made about the resurrection. It is clearly not earthbound if indeed the Son of God has come from heaven, come from a supernatural realm to the material realm, the earth, to die for us. That is certainly not earthbound. It transcends what we know as earth, or in other words, transcends what we know as material. And the last thing that Richard Dawkins said was that it was unworthy. It is an unworthy explanation, essentially, of how we are here and what we are doing here, that we have all of these wonderful scientific discoveries, and the resurrection of Jesus would just simply be unworthy of being an explanation for all of these things. But again, of course, that is not the case. This would be the epitome of what worthiness is. If there is one that is worthy, if there was one story that is worthy, if there is one moment that is worthy, if there is one idea that is worthy, it is the perfect Jesus dying for the imperfect people. We see this played out in movies all the time. We see everybody taking this idea of the hero and the hero laying down his life for those that he's trying to protect. The hero dedicating their life to protecting people. Why is this basically the highest standard of cinema that we have, of a value, of people being shown that their value is incredibly high that somebody would dedicate their life to either protecting them and would be willing to die, these superheroes in these movies would be willing to die in the stead of these people. Why is that the highest order of value that we can authenticate through a movie? Well, because it's grasping at straws. It's just grasping at straws of what Jesus did by coming to this earth and dying for us. So I certainly don't think that Richard Dawkins' point about the resurrection being an unworthy explanation to all the things that we have found scientifically, I think that this is really a huge misunderstanding of what the biblical worldview is. And you can say, of course, you can argue that, well, of course, Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in the biblical worldview. Well, I understand that, but for the sake of his argument, he is saying that the resurrection, if it indeed were true, would not measure up to the explanation of all of these wonderful scientific discoveries that we've made. So in his argument, he is assuming, even if the resurrection were true, it would not be worthy, which is just not the case. The last point that I want to make was about what Richard Dawkins said at the very end about using God as an explanation, as a worldview, is just simply counter to the laws of common sense. I disagree with Richard Dawkins here in a big way. Consider the laws of common sense. Just consider common sense for a moment. If you approach a garden, is it common sense to assume that there is a gardener or not? If you observe human life, is it common sense to think that human life came from something, or that life came from life, or not? Is it common sense for you to walk outside on a dark night and observe the constellations in the skies and just wonder, is there more out there? Is it common sense to require and to desire a sense of purpose for your life? Of course, all of these things that I just mentioned are complete common sense. So if indeed those things are complete common sense, if those are things that we assume and that we understand and that we feel, how is it that God would be counter to common sense? The point is, by using the evidence that God has left for us, we believe that He is the explanation of why we feel these things and why we do have that sense of feeling across these different things. So I certainly don't think the idea of God is counter to common sense. Some might say, again, that it's believing in fairies, it's believing in fairy tales, as some atheists might put it, and Richard Dawkins may even put it in this way, that you're believing in some big man in the sky. And of course, this is just some gross misunderstanding of what the God of the Bible really is. One way or the other, it goes against common sense to not have an explanation for these obvious things that we feel and that we recognize as common sense. I hope you enjoyed this reaction video. If you did, leave a like on this video down below, subscribe to the channel for more reaction videos in the future, and until next time, we'll see you.